to me, Mikhail.
No, I thought about it, but yeah, I put too much effort.
Yeah, and about 2 weeks warning would have helped. All the best, Mikhail.
And contain outbreaks before they spread further.
I thought you left it to me, Mikhail.
No, I thought about it, but
okay, we are on YouTube.
All right, let me know about Facebook, then I can start a watch party, Abby.
Okay, so I think it will exactly start at 1/4 chapter month. Let me put little music also. We have a minute to go.
Dig, dig, digging in the sun. Men must work for me. Dig, dig, digging in the sun. Men must work for me.
It's over to you, Şebnem abla.
Your microphone.
You are muted.
Salam, Sanbanani, Molweni, Namaste, Vanakkam, Hetepu, and welcome to a critical social cohesion webinar organized by the Turquoise Harmony Institute, an organization which promotes social cohesion through dialogue and education so that we may know each other. I'm your host and moderator for this evening, activist, journalist, and mediation practitioner, Shabnam Palesa Mohammed. It, of course, is the 16th of September 2020, also Heritage Month in South Africa. Our topic for this evening's webinar is the South African Reconciliation Barometer's findings, challenges, and opportunities that are going to be unpacked for us by an executive or a member of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. We're looking forward to this. But for us all to enjoy the conversation this evening and to interact, the THI, of course, welcomes everyone who's tuned into this incredible opportunity for learning, sharing, and organizing. So we encourage you to share watch parties of this event from the THI's Facebook page, and of course, to share the YouTube link with your friends, your family, and your colleagues. To do the formal introduction on behalf of the Turquoise Harmony Institute, we welcome Aideen Inal, who is the Western Cape Director of the Turquoise Harmony Institute.
Thank you very much, Shabnam, and welcome to Stan and Mikhail and everyone who is watching us on various platforms. On behalf of Turquoise, my job is to welcome everyone and express our appreciation for staying with us, despite the president is addressing the nation about what is going to be happening in the days to come. And also, therefore, we hope that some will watch afterwards from our different platforms, and we want to greet everyone as well. But just to say a few words about Turquoise, those who are familiar know the kind of work that we do. We were established in 2006, and since then we've been engaging in different kinds of activities and projects to promote dialogue and understanding between people of different backgrounds. As you can see from our motto, we are inspired by the motto of so we may know one another, which reminds us that the more we know one another, less conflicts we hopefully will face, and it's going to be easier to resolve our differences, to resolve our issues. And the Turquoise, the founders of Turquoise, they are the volunteers of an international civil society movement called Hizmet Movement, inspired by teachings of scholar Fethullah Gülen. And the main reason for establishment of Turquoise is that one of the major ills of today is disunity, and that this unity arises out of lack of knowledge and lack of interaction about the other. And therefore, just to say a few words about this evening's event, I think it's very significant that we are looking at the reconciliation barometer, because reconciliation perhaps is one of the most important points that we have to focus in South Africa right now. And since the dawn of democracy, many things have been done. A lot has been achieved, but obviously reconciliation project is not something that you would achieve overnight. So we are trying to play our little part, and we will also be learning from tonight's findings so that it can guide us in what we do in future. So thank you very much again to IJR, to Stan, to Mikhail, for coming forward and accepting our invitation. So we look forward to a great learning experience.
Thank you very, very much to Aideen Inal, who is representing the Turquoise Harmony Institute, of course, the Western Cape Regional Director of the THI, for helping to coordinate this really critical and vibrant event that we're hosting this evening. Next up in our program, we're going to have a few words from the Executive Director of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, Stan Henkemann. Welcome, sir, to this webinar.
Thank you very much, Shabnan, and thank you to the Turquoise Harmony Institute for this invitation to partner with you. I'm excited every time we are able to share the insights from the Reconciliation Barometer. And tonight, I think Mikhail will give us a really good insight into what South Africans think about where we are at. But this year, the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation celebrates 20 years of existence. So, and it's 20 years of making a contribution to building fair, democratic, and inclusive societies. And so just in that vision, you can see the synergy between the two organizations in the way that we want to help shape our world. And at the moment, we kind of run along a number of themes as an organization to try and give kind of shape to this vision. And so if I can just quickly mention them. So we have a theme on advancing human dignity so that we can have bottom-up reconciliation and not top-down. A second one is what we call transitional and survivor-centered justice. And again, very often the perpetrators are up front. And the third theme is the theme that is important for the rest of the continent, and we call it cross-border dialogues and regional reconciliation. And of course, the idea is that if there's instability in one country, it invariably spills over into other countries. And then we have a theme on anti-racism, social cohesion, and social inclusion. There's one on gender justice and reconciliation. And then there's a theme which I think is really critical for our times. It's called socioeconomic justice and inclusive development. And then we have one on environmental justice. And of course, we have a theme on youth. So that gives you a sense of where our focus is. Tonight, Mikhail will share with you some facts and insights around the barometer. But let me just very briefly say why I think the Reconciliation Barometer is an important thing in this country. We are really pleased that government is beginning to take note of our work. In last year's 25-year review that the president shared with the nation, one of the Reconciliation Barometer was quoted in there. And so for us, it's important that we are recognized in that way. But let me say that I think the barometer is important, and it will be important going forward because it kind of reflects the voice of the people. It's a public perception survey. And I think that's important in this time that we live, where there's a tendency to kind of suppress what the people think and what the people say. But secondly, I think also, and again, in this world that we live in of fake news and so on, this barometer is an antidote to that because it deals with the facts. It deals with what people really want to say. And then I think it also serves as a mirror to society, serves as a mirror to those in authority. It serves as a mirror to those of us who are being governed. But it also then tells us how far we've come as a country, or how far we still have to go. So we think it's a critically important tool for our country, and it will be going forward. And so it is our pleasure to be part of this opportunity to share these findings with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Executive Director of the IJR, Stan Henkemann, for giving us that background and context. Certainly very interesting, and good to see that government is paying attention to this really important work. So just to recap, our topic frame for tonight, the Turquoise Harmony Institute, in collaboration with the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, hosts this webinar on the findings of the IJR's 2019 SARB report. Mikhail Musa from the IJR will conduct a presentation. It will be followed by questions, comments, and ideas from our audience. And of course, significantly, it's a critical conversation as the report holds a lens at the current situation in South Africa, assisting us to see where the areas of concern are and how South African perceptions are changing. The presentation is based on the report, which is based on the survey conducted last year, and we'll have to look at the outcomes and evaluate the findings in light of developments since then. Specifically, we're shining a light on reconciliation, social cohesion, transformation, and democratic governance. So what are the questions that we're asking? 26 years after apartheid, have we reconciled? And what are our views on social cohesion, transformation, and democratic governance? All of which will make us reflect on the past, ventilate the present, and plan for the future that we want. The program format is designed this evening for us to learn from each other and to enjoy interactivity. So we'll begin with about a 30-minute conversation or presentation with Mikhail Musa from the IJR, leaving us with at least 30 minutes for your questions, your comments, and your ideas. Let us introduce Mikhail Musa from the IJR. Mikhail's project is the South African Reconciliation Barometer, a public opinion survey on reconciliation, social cohesion, and political culture conducted by the IJR. He is responsible for project management and disseminating the findings of the survey. Mikhail holds a master's degree in development studies from the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex, as a Chevening Scholar. He also holds a Bachelor of Social Science and honors degrees in politics from the University of Cape Town. Welcome, and let us engage your very interesting presentation. Mikhail Musa from the IJR.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Shabnam. And thank you very much to the Turquoise Institute as well for organizing this and for hosting us. As I would like to echo Stan and say it's a big opportunity for us to be able to present this. And I'm looking forward to the discussion as well. So I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully you'll be able to see my presentation. So as has been mentioned, this will be a presentation on the South African Reconciliation Barometer report from 2019. And these are just the details here. So the outline of the presentation will be fairly straightforward, but I'd like for it to be an engaging one for us to maybe discuss some of the findings that are presented, but also if there are any queries regarding what I present, we can maybe discuss those. And also South Africans' perceptions about these sorts of things. I think that's really what I'd hope to bring out of this presentation is something for us to discuss. So first of all, I'm going to briefly explain what the South African Reconciliation Barometer is. And on this presentation, you'll see that I've abbreviated it to SARB. So that's obviously referring to the Reconciliation Barometer and of course not to the Reserve Bank. Then I'm just going to briefly discuss how we conduct the survey. Some people are quite interested in how we are able to talk about this data, how we gather it as well, but also just to show that it's a very robust set of data. It's very accurate. It's using the best methods of quantitative public opinion that we have at the moment. And then I'm also going to talk about what we are trying to measure as well. So you can conduct a survey and ask anyone almost anything, but we have particular things that we're interested in, and that really informs ideas about reconciliation and social cohesion. And then I'm going to talk through some of the main results and trends that have emerged in the survey from last year particularly, but also over time as well, which allows us to track changes in public opinion. And then there'll, of course, be time for conclusions and discussion. So if you see something in the presentation that you'd like to know more about, something that you'd like to comment on, please feel free to post those comments, to engage with us in the chat as well, and we'll have a discussion about that afterwards. So what is the South African Reconciliation Barometer? So this is the latest iteration of the Reconciliation Barometer. This is the front page to the 2019 report. And it is a report from December last year. And the data from which it was based was collected in July and August of last year. And the great thing about the Reconciliation Barometer, unlike a lot of data sets and surveys, is that it's freely available online on IJR's website. So if you'd like to follow along as well, if you just go to ijr.org.za, go into our publication sections, you can download this for free. And it's very extensive. I'll just be sharing some of the main findings, but there's a lot more information that I couldn't possibly present on today. But if you are interested in this, I would encourage you to check it out. So what is the Reconciliation Barometer? Essentially, as Stan mentioned, the Reconciliation Barometer is integral to IJR's work. And following in the kind of tradition of what IJR does, the Reconciliation Barometer allows us to understand public opinion in South Africa since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the late 1990s. So IJR was set up with the understanding that the work of the TRC needs to continue well past the initial commission, and that we need to continue fostering the sort of values that the TRC aimed to introduce. And the best way to really do this is to understand how far we've progressed over time. So it is a nationally representative public opinion survey in South Africa, which means that we are very confident that the views reflected in this, the data that we are able to gather from the survey, is representative of the entire nation of South Africa. And I think it's also important to say here that the survey has been conducted since 2003, actually. So it's one of the longest running projects at IJR. And of course, it is the longest running survey of reconciliation anywhere in the world. It's currently conducted every 2 years. So the latest data we have is from 2019, which means that we'll be fielding a survey next year as well, which will be very interesting, of course, given the sort of dramatic events that have occurred in this past year. So this allows us to track changes in public opinion over time. So what someone thought in 2019, of course, might not necessarily be the same thing that they think in 2021. So as I mentioned, the survey has been carried out since 2003. It is the oldest reconciliation survey of its kind, and there are various other sorts of reconciliation barometers that have followed suit in different countries all over the world. And I think it also just speaks to the quality of the SARB, that when other countries are interested in carrying out this sort of survey, the South African Reconciliation Barometer stands out as the kind of go-to gold standard for this sort of survey. So I think it's also important to just reiterate that while South Africa has very unique issues and a rather divisive past, these sorts of issues are prevalent in countries throughout the world as well. So I think the most important thing about SARB today is that it tracks changes and continuity in public opinion over time. So as I mentioned, we conduct it every 2 years, but also what we're able to do is see how the national opinion has changed between 2003 and now, and of course in more brief periods. And I think you'll see that coming up in some of the data that we'll present. So what is the methodology involved? How do we gather the data? How do we know that it's accurate? And what do we do with it? So we conduct face-to-face interviews with people. So it's not a telephonic survey. It's not done online. The best way to gather data anywhere in the world, but especially in South Africa with large rural populations or people with limited access to the internet or electricity, is to go and speak to them. And to do it in a language of their choice. So we do the interview not just in English or in Afrikaans, but we do it in multiple languages, allowing us to obviously contact as many people as we need to in order to make sure that the data is accurate. So the sample that we use is quite a small sample to some people who aren't familiar with surveys, but it is quite robust. We use 2,400 adult South Africans in all 9 provinces. So this means that we're able to get a very representative sample of South Africans' opinions by just using 2,400 in the sample. And again, this sort of technique is standard across the world. It's the same thing that Statistics South Africa uses. You don't have to physically speak to every single person, but you can get a fairly good idea of what people are thinking by focusing on a specific amount of South Africans in all 9 provinces to ensure that their opinion is represented across the country. So then we've got a stratified multi-stage sample design, and that is just a very fancy term for saying that the sample we choose, those 2,400 South Africans, is in some respects almost completely random. So we don't target particular people, we don't ask for people's names, we don't go to particular places, you can't volunteer to do the survey. It has to be fairly random at some level within the sample for it to be accurate. And of course, the data is weighted according to various variables. So according to race classification, gender, age, province. And we do this not only to make sure that the data is accurate, but also that we're able to disaggregate the data. So we're able to see what men think about something or what women think about something, whether young people have different opinions to older people, and also if some issues are more pertinent in particular provinces than other provinces as well. So again, this allows us a lot of room to analyze the data and to really draw interesting conclusions, not only across South Africa, but within it as well, to isolate those sorts of differences. And again, just to underline, the survey is nationally representative. So we have a 95% confidence level that the data is accurate within a 2 percentage point margin of error, which means we're very confident up to the highest level of survey design. So now that kind of outline of the survey is done, we can start to move to some of the more interesting themes that we hope to measure. So what are we trying to conceptualize? What are we trying to measure when we field the questionnaire, when we design the questions, when we ask South Africans their opinion on these sorts of things? So more recently, the survey has gone through a bit of a redesign in terms of how we conceptualize reconciliation. Before, the survey was very much focused on the legacy of apartheid, on people's perceptions of the TRC. But as time goes on, and of course, as the population becomes younger, those sorts of opinions are somewhat less important. But there are other things that are also parts of reconciliation that are very important to measure. So we isolated into 5 different kind of variables to try get a sense of what reconciliation means. So the first one is power relations. How do people see power manifesting in society? Do they believe that they themselves have power? Do they think other people do? And is power being more equally distributed within democracy? In terms of political culture, do people feel as though they are Democrats? Do they think democracy is working for them? Do they feel they are represented? These are all questions that we're interested in. And of course, we've kept the section on the legacy of apartheid as well, because it's a central focus of the survey. It always has been. And it's a very useful measure to keep including. So we see how people remember the past. That's also an important part of reconciliation, is people's attitudes towards the past, and especially towards a past as divisive as ours. And the second last one we look at is racial reconciliation. So we know, of course, that race is a major factor in South African society. It's a major line of dividing society. And how are people coming together in a more equal society, in a society where people don't have different rights based on their race groups? But is this necessarily leading to any sorts of changes in society? And again, that's something that the survey is very good at doing. Because we hold the survey regularly, we're able to see if there are any changes that are occurring over time. Are things getting better? Are they getting worse? Or are they staying the same as well? And this is the value of having the survey over such a long period of time, is we're able to go back to look at what people thought about maybe 10, 12 years ago, but we're also able to anticipate what people might think in the next years going forward. So reconciliation, is it wanted and is it possible? So this is really the fundamental point of the survey as well. We have to ask people this in order to understand how they think about other things as well. So what do people mean by reconciliation? As Stan mentioned, the survey gives a voice to people. We don't try to impose our views on people. We don't try to lead them in terms of the questions that we ask, but we allow people to choose their own definitions, to choose their own understanding of important words like reconciliation or cohesion. So we've been asking South Africans, what do they understand by the term reconciliation for the last 15 years? And one of the most consistent findings from the survey is that around 40% of South Africans, which of course is not a majority, but it is the highest share of all the options that we give, say that they associate forgiveness with reconciliation. There are other terms that we provide people with, and they can choose any one of them. Peace is another very popular one. Moving on, this idea of progressing past a traumatic event or traumatic period, and ideas about truth and respect as well. And I think if you're familiar with the TRC process, then perhaps this answer would not be particularly surprising, given its sort of focus on truth telling and on providing amnesty and forgiveness to people. But I think it's also important to realize that South Africans associate the term reconciliation with the idea of forgiving, of peace, of moving on. And I think that should ground our discussion going forward as well, is people don't necessarily associate reconciliation with becoming one, but about forgiving things that have happened in the past, forgiving transgressions as well. So what is the progress of reconciliation? Do people feel as though they've experienced it? Do they think that it's occurred in South Africa? And is there an appetite for more or less of it going forward? So again, we ask South Africans, we give them a list of statements, and we ask them whether they agree, neither agree nor disagree, or disagree. And of course, we provide a scale to allow people to answer this question. And we see that most South Africans, about 3 in 4 South Africans, 77%, agree that South Africans still need reconciliation. And I think that's an important finding from the survey, not only for the survey's sake, but also for the sake of IJR as an organization that's interested in doing the work of reconciliation, showing that there's a clear appetite by the public for reconciliation to still take place in South Africa so long after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has finished its work. We see that about 2/3 of South Africans, 66% of people in the survey, said that they believe the TRC provided a good foundation for South Africa to achieve reconciliation. And this is quite an interesting finding. The TRC, of course, was not a perfect process. It had its critics at the time. And perhaps more recently, it's gotten quite a lot of criticism. But I think it's an important thing to realize that the vast majority of South Africans think it was a good idea in order to achieve reconciliation going forward. Then if we lower the kind of level of analysis that we're looking at, South Africans have made progress in reconciliation since the end of apartheid. Only 57% of South Africans agree about this, which of course is still a majority, but perhaps not as high as we would like it to be. And I think that kind of connects to this idea that we still need reconciliation going forward. And if we look at the individual level or at the household level, when we ask, my friends and family have experienced reconciliation after the end of apartheid, only 51% of South Africans, so a very small majority of people agree that they have experienced reconciliation after the end of apartheid. So again, we can see that there's a national narrative that emerges from this, that we still need reconciliation even after the TRC, and that we have made progress, but not as convincing as we'd like it to be, and certainly not at the individual or the familial level, where only a small majority of people feel that they've experienced reconciliation. So, what are the barriers to reconciliation? We know that South Africans still want it to occur. We know that perhaps they're not as happy in terms of its success in the democratic era, but why is there a barrier to experiencing reconciliation? So again, we gave people a number of statements and asked them whether they agree, disagree, or neither. And again, we see the results here. We see that Racism, 66% of South Africans agree that racism is not being sufficiently addressed in South Africa. And again, we've seen this over the last weeks and months, certainly in the news, and again in all sorts of public debates about the place of race in contemporary South Africa. Another thing that emerges is that gender-based violence is seen as a barrier to reconciliation. South Africa, of course, has among the highest rates of gender-based violence in the world. Interestingly, South Africans think that using race categories to measure transformation is a barrier to achieving reconciliation, because we're still measuring people by this particular race categories that they were measured by or sorted by under apartheid as well. And of course, this has been a contentious issue in terms of BEE and affirmative action. And of course, I don't have to go through all of this, but the biggest response that we've seen, 84% of South Africans agree that reconciliation is impossible as long as corruption continues in our country. And that was a new question that we asked South Africans. So that's by far seen by the most amount of people as a major barrier to achieving reconciliation. So I think it's important to understand here that corruption is not simply an issue of bad governance. It's not something that empowers a few people to leverage the state, but it's something that severely damages our trust in each other, in society, and in government as well. So then I'll just go over this section quite briefly, because I think a lot of it is fairly well established, but it's important that we keep asking these sorts of questions. What is the legacy of apartheid and how much has changed? So we ask South Africans to respond to 5 categories: race relations, safety, inequality, employment, and corruption. And these are just kind of important issues that affect people on an everyday basis. And we ask them, has this improved? Has it got worse? Or has it stayed the same since 1994? And again, you can see the results here. So only 38.5%, only about 39% of South Africans believe that race relations have improved since 1994. And when you think that they couldn't possibly get much worse before then, it really shows you how slow the rate of improvement has been in democracy. So 32% say it stayed the same, and some people, about a third of South Africans, actually think it's got worse. Similar example with safety, people don't feel that safety, their level of personal safety or their family has improved substantially. They also feel that they're actually more likely to think that inequality has gotten worse since 1994 than it has improved. And I think a lot of economic data would support that assertion. Employment opportunities, many people, 43% of people say that their employment opportunities have gotten worse since 1994. And something, again, just to echo the previous slide, is that just under half of South Africans think that corruption has gotten worse since 1994 than before. Now, there's quite a lot of caveats to this data. We're a much more free and open society where people are able to express their opinion, where they have access to more information about this sort of stuff than was the case before 1994. So I think we shouldn't take this perception data necessarily as fact, but I think it's very telling that 25 years after democracy, that people think that a lot of these sorts of things haven't improved, and unfortunately, in some cases, have actually gotten worse. So another thing that we were also interested in is transformation in the workplace. This is, of course, just been a contentious issue with various parties drafting policy positions on this recently, but also a debate in the media. So South Africans, interestingly, think that the workforce should be a representative of all the sorts of employment equity targets that we currently have of race, gender, and ability or disability. So we see a high level of agreement that we should make the workforce representative. But what we don't see is most people saying that we should use race categories to measure progress. Unfortunately, we don't have more recent data for this. The last data point was 2013. But I think it also presents a dilemma in how South Africans think about race. We want the workforce to be representative of race. We want people to have equal opportunities for employment. But how do we measure that? How do we ensure that people are able to be given equal opportunity without resorting to the same race categories that very much confined South Africans before 1994 as well? So that's just an interesting point to note, that there are broad senses of agreement that we should make things representative, but how can we do that without using race categories as well? So maybe that's a point for discussion afterwards. Then we also look at national identity, perceptions of unity, and the understanding of what nation building might be. So we are South Africans again, a whole bunch of questions on national identity. And again, this is perhaps a surprising slide, is that South Africans, generally speaking, at least in 2019, when this survey was carried out, were generally quite positive about national unity, about having a national identity. So while there is, of course, many divisions in society, very high levels of unemployment, racism is still unfortunately prevalent. We live in quite a patriarchal society, a very conservative one as well. When you ask South Africans if it is possible or desirable to create a united South African nation out of all these different groups in the society, you find that the vast majority of South Africans agree that not only is it possible, but it's desirable to create a united sense of national identity out of this. And many South Africans, despite their linkages to language groups, to ethnicities, to their class composition as well, many South Africans, the vast majority, think that being a South African is an important part of their identity. And they're quite proud to be South African. So in as much as we have our problems with social identities and with all sorts of divisions, the underlying theme that we get from the survey is that there is a strong sense of national unity, that South Africans are quite proud of who they are as South Africans as well. And again, what we've done just to illustrate this point is we've managed to ask this question every year between 2003, the first round of the survey, to 2019, and we can show the results, the changes in public opinion over time through every round of the survey. So if we look here, we can see that actually public support for creating a united nation, whether it is desirable or possible to be a united South Africa, has always been relatively high. But if you notice, in the last few rounds of the survey, especially since 2013, which was the lowest level of support, we see that support for or agreement with the idea that South Africa could be a united nation and that it is possible and desirable to do so has increased since 2013 to some of its highest levels over time. So again, this is the value of the survey, is tracking changes in public opinion over time. But what are the sources of division in society? What do South Africans identify as the major sources of division, the obstacles to reconciliation, the barriers to social cohesion? And this is another prominent finding from the survey that we've managed to identify every year since 2003, is that it is not, in fact, race relations, as is perhaps conventionally thought of as the major barrier to reconciliation in South Africa. Instead, it is inequality, or as we phrase it, the gap between the rich and the poor, which is the major obstacle to reconciliation in South Africa. Of course, race relations are a major barrier. It's a major source of division in society. Just under half of South Africans identify it as one. But inequality, which is of course linked to race, but definitely speaks to the level of class division in society, is in fact identified by South Africans as the major source of division in society. And interestingly as well, from last year at least, political parties are seen as a source of division in South Africa. And just a caveat on this sort of point, we find that people see political parties as divisive, particularly in election years. which is when the survey was carried out last year, was of course an election year. So in other sorts of years, they're not seen as divisive, but I think it speaks to the character of South Africa's elections, the fact that they're becoming increasingly political, the fact that there are simply more parties available to vote for now, who are seen as credible by a larger source of the population, that political parties are seen as sources of division. But really the takeaway point here is that inequality, not simply race relations, is seen as the major source of division in society. So we also have a section in the survey on socioeconomic inclusion and exclusion. And we really built this into the survey on the back of the finding that inequality is a major source of division in society. So if inequality is the primary barrier to reconciliation, why are people thinking that? What is their level of inclusion in the economy? And what is their level of exclusion as well? So we asked South Africans questions about social mobility. And this is a really interesting set of questions. We asked South Africans, do you believe that you have the necessary resources to achieve your goals? And we don't define those goals, because goals, depending on who you are, is based off your own expectations in life, your own capabilities, but of course your own desires. But do people feel that they have the resources to achieve that? So we list 4 sets of resources which we think are kind of material resources, things that require a little bit of money in order to achieve. But interestingly, we also have self-confidence and self-determination, which are, of course, all about your own personal resolve to achieve your goals. So on the material side, we find that less than half of South Africans agree that they have the financial resources to achieve their goals. And of course, this speaks to very high levels of inequality, of high levels of poverty across the country as well, which unfortunately means that many people feel that they don't have the financial resources to achieve their goals. So we talk about social capital as well. We don't use that phrase in the survey, but I've just done it here to shorten it. But whether people feel that they have access to friends and family, to the sorts of connections that will help people further their ambitions. And again, we see that because of inequality and because of high levels of poverty, that unfortunately, less than half of South Africans agree that they have access to this sort of resource to achieve their goals. And then more interestingly, in terms of access to transport and education, close to half of South Africans agree that the education that they're receiving is sufficient or is just about good enough in order for them to achieve their goals, which is perhaps different to the perception that we might have intuitively about the state of education or transport. But again, those are not particularly promising numbers. It's either about half of South Africans or a minority think that they have the resources to achieve their goals. But perhaps most interestingly about this particular slide is that around 2/3 of South Africans feel that they are confident enough to achieve their goals. So despite the sorts of barriers that people face, despite limited access to financial resources, limited access to friends and family who could help them out, or to a quality education which will put them on that path to perhaps finding a job or fulfilling any other type of ambition that might come with education, we see that a lot more people are confident in themselves in order to achieve their goals. And I think this is a really promising finding that we have in the survey. The fact that people think that they have enough to achieve their goals and that it is possible that they will do so. And certainly we see it in even greater proportion with self-determination as well. So South Africans are, despite all the barriers that many of them face, are very confident and determined to achieve their goals, despite the obstacles of perhaps poverty or inequality as well. So moving on to the next slide on interpersonal trust and relations. This is, of course, a crucial part of social cohesion, of reconciliation as well. How do people trust other people? Who do they trust? Who don't they trust? And how do they relate to other groups of people as well? So what we see in terms of interpersonal trust, we ask South Africans, how much do you trust the following groups of people? And right at the top, most people, 2/3 of South Africans say that they trust their relatives a great deal or quite a lot, which of course you'd think is perhaps natural, but it also shows that South Africans are very trusting of people who are within their immediate circle. So these are people who probably speak the same language, who from a similar area, with a similar upbringing. South Africans' trust is extended to a very small circle of people, and that's their relatives. And then if you go down the list, I've gone from most trusted to least trusted, most trusted at the top. We find that neighbors are the second. And again, neighbors are people who live in a similar area, again, might speak a similar language, but less than half of South Africans say that they have a great deal or quite a lot of trust in their neighbors. Colleagues are next, people you interact with at work, and then is really where it kind of gets interesting, where people become a little more distrustful of people, is when they see that people are from a different religion, whether they're from a different language group, a different race group, certainly, and another big prejudice in society is a different sexual orientation as well. So really what we're seeing is that South Africans are very, very trusting of people that they know that are perhaps very similar to them. But as soon as you extend that circle of trust outwards, in terms of people who are different to the respondents to the survey, so people who have different cultural beliefs, different backgrounds, different ways of life, South Africans are less and less trusting of this. And unfortunately, at the bottom here, you can see that the least trusted group by South Africans in society. So I should have highlighted the levels of distrust here, but you can see only about 20% of South Africans have a great deal or quite a lot of trust in foreign nationals. And this is relatively unsurprising when you consider the frequency of xenophobic rhetoric and unfortunately conflict in South African society. And this is borne out in the survey, where most South Africans are in fact distrustful of people who are from other countries, but in particular from other African countries as well. So really, when you consider levels of trust, relatives and neighbors are the most trusted, but the further out you go, the further removed from the respondent you go, especially when it's people from different countries, you see that South Africans can become very distrustful of people who are different from themselves. So lastly, just to mention perceptions of violence or safety, and it's linked to reconciliation as well, because I think a lot of distrust, a lot of prejudice that arises in society comes from people's perceptions of safety. And what we see is that South Africans, South Africa has a very high level of crime, a very high level of violent crime, unfortunately. Murder, gender-based violence, these are all very prevalent issues in society. So we see that South Africans, again, feel most safe at home, which is good, obviously. You'd hope that that's the case. But as further out you go, people feel less and less safe. So they feel slightly less safe at work or their place of study, slightly less safe at shops or malls, unfortunately less safe in their neighborhood. And then again, when you start to interact with people who are outside of your circle of trust, so strangers you might meet on public transport or in recreational places, you see that most South Africans do not feel safe in those sorts of spaces as well. So again, this is just to link perceptions of safety, of feeling secure with issues of trust and of the other as well. So as further out you go, away from your own comfort zone, we see that the public opinion data shows that people feel more and more unsafe. So in summary, I know I've been speaking for quite a long time, but I'd just like to wrap it up for us to have a discussion about afterwards. The survey essentially shows quite a lot of strengths in South African society, quite a lot of positives that we can take forward when assessing social cohesion or the state of reconciliation. And the first thing that we can see is that reconciliation is wanted. It's something that South Africans feel is valuable. It's something that's worth pursuing. Unfortunately, we're not at the point that perhaps we wanted to be at this stage in time, but there is still an appetite for wanting to be better, for wanting to be closer to one another, for wanting to be united. And I think that's an important takeaway from the survey, is that all hope is not lost. There is an appetite for wanting to further these sorts of processes. Unity is wanted and deemed possible. So despite our differences, despite so many different language groups, our history of inequality and racism, despite levels of crime in society or fear of other people, unity is an idea that people are attracted to and something that they feel is possible going forward. And I think that's, again, something that we should take from this survey, is that we have to build on this sort of public appetite for these concepts. And of course, that there is a shared national identity. So once you have a shared identity, once you're able to speak to people as a collective, as part of a commonality of sorts, it's much easier to see the similarities between us than the differences between us. And again, something I didn't touch on in this presentation, but we've seen a renewal of trust in institutions between 2017, which was the previous round, and 2019, which was the most recent round. And this is, we're able to see this renewal of trust because we ask the same questions over time. And again, this is a positive that we have to build on. We have to ensure that trust in institutions is furthered going forward. But of course, there are some weaknesses that the report identifies, or rather some challenges for us to confront and hopefully to overcome. And that is confidence in institutions. People are generally quite pessimistic about accountability. Things like corruption are seen as an obstacle to reconciliation. And of course, people are voting less and less. People feel disenchanted with their public representatives. This is borne out in not only the survey, but also in voter trends as well. We see more and more people opting out of elections because they feel that their public representatives don't take their opinion seriously. And this is something that we really have to remedy going forward for the good of our democracy. We also see that there are significant challenges when it comes to socioeconomic inclusion. So attitudes towards transformation, we know that we want the workforce to be representative of South Africa and all its diversities, but how is the best way to do that? How do we ensure that people who need to benefit from these policies are doing so? And we also need to confront the legacies of the economy that we've inherited from the past. How do we make this an economy that's more inclusive, to make sure that when economic growth does eventually reappear again, that it's an inclusive form that gives people livelihood opportunities? And of course, perhaps the most significant one is relations between people in South Africa. So relations between people of different race groups, of different language groups, sexual orientations. How do we ensure that trust is restored in these sorts of relations? How do we ensure that if there is any antagonism, that we can hopefully intervene and manage it and ensure that it doesn't lead to conflict? And of course, how can we ensure that people who were not born in South Africa but who live here are seen as part of our communities, who are seen as part of being of this country, despite the fact that they might not have been born here? And I think that's where I'll wrap it up. And just to say something about the issue of violence and safety and peace, generally speaking, as I mentioned on that slide, this is a significant barrier in terms of people being able to trust one another, being able to interact. And it's really the most obvious form of distrust and of antagonism between people is conflict. So yeah, those were just some of the challenges I identified in the report, and I would welcome any sorts of queries or challenges or any sorts of questions about how we do the survey, what I've presented, but also how we can take this going forward. What are we able to do to intervene to see the public opinion data that's been represented by the survey, and how do we build on that? How do we make sure that we overcome these challenges as well? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mikhail Musa. An absolutely fascinating and compelling presentation from Mikhail Musa of the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, giving us lots of food for thought and ideas for action. Ultimately, South Africans are proud of our national identity, despite the serious challenges that we face. So it would appear that the ground is fertile for civil society to organize for the kind of country that we want. I want to take some questions and comments from our audiences on Zoom and on Facebook and on YouTube before we maybe tackle some of the notes that I've taken during what was a very interesting presentation. Let's start with Facebook first, Mikhail. Onika Nontlantla Makwakwa says, how does true reconciliation happen when there's no remorse, apology, or request for forgiveness? And perhaps as a response to that one, we have Jan de Groef who says, at times forgiveness works as an incentive to move forward. If there is no forgiveness, the infernal cycle of violence will continue. It asks for the free action of the person. It cannot be imposed. But he also asks the question, where should one start to address the division and promote a more united nation, at the top or at the bottom? So let's try and address Onika and Jan. Onika, of course, asking, how does reconciliation happen when there's no remorse, apology, or request for forgiveness? And Jan then saying, how do we address the division and promote a more united nation, at the top or at the bottom, which seems to be the only paradigm that the majority of people understand, top or bottom?
Those are great questions. So thank you for posing them. I think that is the real crux of this problem of why we haven't been able to resolve it going forward. But I would say that perhaps, again, one of the criticisms of the TRC process was that it tended to focus on individuals. It tended to individualize problems as perpetrators and as victims, rather than seeing it as a sort of systemic violation of entire people's rights as well. And I also think that it requires, those sorts of vast problems require substantive solutions as well. So asking an individual for forgiveness or granting an individual amnesty perhaps doesn't really do much to advance the broader goal of reconciliation as well. But that, again, that it's all linked to the sorts of issues that we identified in the survey. So if South Africans are saying that inequality is the major source of division in society, then we need to address inequality. And what does that look like, of course? Well, it means people who have benefited for decades, for centuries in South Africa from favorable policies, having to give up some of that privilege, or at the very least acknowledging that sort of privilege that they've accumulated over time. And also, on the one hand, it also means that people who have been underdeveloped, people who simply haven't had access to these sorts of resources, people who have suffered immensely over the last decades and centuries, these people need to see the real kind of material benefits of democracy as well. So I think that there's some truth in that statement. It is very difficult to simply achieve reconciliation by asking or getting forgiveness. It has to have some sort of material benefit in terms of the society that we live in now compared to the one that we lived in before. And in terms of nation building, I think that is quite a tricky project to initiate. It has tended to be in the realm of a top-down approach. And perhaps that's something that we need to relook if people are feeling that it's not being effective, is that we need to encourage a more synergistic relationship between government on one hand and civil society on the other as well. So yeah, that would be my point, just to bring that in, is that there has to be some sort of very substantive material issue to resolve the inequalities in society that we're still seeing today. And forgiveness, I think what we're starting to see is simply just not going to cut it for most people. But I would also be interested to hear Stan's thoughts about this as well.
All right, let's turn the mic over to Stan, and then I might have a question for Aideen if he wants to take them about the role of religious groups in this transformation. But let's give the mic to Stan on that one.
Thank you so much. I think this is such a critical question. These two questions together, it's really, really fascinating because it does speak to the kind of narratives that are out there. And I think what we have to understand when we talk about reconciliation, it's not a light switch. You can't say if you do this, then you have reconciliation. Reconciliation for the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation is the reward for justice. And so we can't just want to push reconciliation in, while you still have these inequalities and these levels of mistrust. We must bear in mind that as a country, we are in transition. We're transitioning from one type of governance to a more democratic culture. And again, that takes time. And so when you talk about transitional justice, you have to also look at a number of critical things. Accountability for what went wrong. You have to talk about the truth recovery. These are things that the TRC tried to surface. You also have to have the kind of reform, for instance, to reduce inequality, to reduce levels of poverty. And again, something that some people might not like to hear is the issue of reparations. Because how do you expect people who have gone through generations of exclusion, of being held back, to now suddenly be on the same level with other people? And when those things are in place, those are the ingredients that will foster reconciliation, social cohesion.
Let's turn the mic over to Aideen now to ask that question about the role of religious organizations in this transformation, because it certainly is a very important question, isn't it? Jan de Groef asks, what could be the role of religious groups in this transformation? Aideen?
Thank you, Shabna, and thank you for the question. I think, I think South Africa is still quite a religious society. So most of South Africans, they belong to some form of religious tradition, and therefore it is extremely important that the leadership of religious communities, they adopt a more inclusivist and less exclusivist stance against the people of different religions and different backgrounds. And I think in the presentation, we've seen that the difference plays a role in people trusting or not trusting the other. So, and religious difference is obviously one of these factors, I think. And the other thing, I think much of the problems that we see in practice, direct racism, etc., they have their roots in the cultures. So it's more like a cultural racism that is embedded in our personalities and in our perceptions that come out once in a while in practice. And therefore, I think these can only be addressed if we keep talking about these and trying to address them on a continuous basis. And I think leadership of the religious communities, they are at a very good position because they are with the people, they are in contact with the people, and I think they get listened to as well by the masses quite a lot. And therefore, it's very important that they really consciously make an effort to contribute towards a more embracing society.
Absolutely agree with you. There was a comment that I think is relevant to what Stan is saying or saying just now when I posted the invitation to this webinar from Atikwa Ethel, and she says, the words reconcile and reconciliation always sound very dyslexic to me. To reconcile suggests that there was unity before conflict or separation. No, I have not reconciled. The invader settler has completely alienated and radicalized me with their continued savagery since 1994. I do not want to reconcile with them. They are too harmful and my values will never be lowered for them. I will never hold out an olive branch as we Black people so foolishly did since 1994. Any comments on that very strong opinion, Stan?
Yes, I can in some way understand where the comments like that come from. And again, you know, it kind of highlights the importance of us, you know, using this data and to say, how do we deal with the challenges that are presented to us? Because, you know, and this is why I said earlier, you know, on the one hand, we are gratified that government is at least looking at this data, but at the same time, it's really, really critical to understand why people are angry. And those, you know, a lot of that anger is legitimate. You know, if you are still experiencing the challenges that your parents experience and their parents experience, what has changed for you? So I think before we write off people who respond in a particular way, doesn't matter what the response is, try and understand where they're coming from. What is it that kind of caused them to have this strong sentiment? And I think that you know, those conversations need to be had. Those are difficult conversations. But unless we have these difficult conversations, we will not move forward.
Unmute the mic. They absolutely agree. Onika Nonhlanhla Makwakwa says yes to reparations. All right, we've got an important question here for you, Mikhail, from Aisha Kaji, who says, please explain a bit more about how you sampled the respondents, urban versus rural, age, race, and class demographics, etc.
Sure, thanks for that. I think it's an important question. It's generally something I don't tend to get into too much detail because some people are very interested in it and some people can get a bit bored with it. But basically what we do is we take all the kind of available data we have from Statistics South Africa. So we take the census, which was last conducted in 2011, but they also do a mid-year population estimate every year. And what this essentially means is that they are updating the population numbers or their estimates of the population, and not only the total number of the population, but all sorts of other demographics. How many people live in cities, how many people live in rural areas, and those sorts of those data points as well. And we use that as the model for the sample that we select. So we try to match it up with Stats SA as much as possible to make sure that it's accurate. So if I think it's roughly 60% of South Africans live in urban areas, then 60% of our sample needs to be from an urban area. If you know, we know that X amount of people are classified as Indian, for example, then we need to have X amount of people in the sample, you know, representing that sort of Indian opinion, as it were. So unfortunately, we have to use rather crude categories, male, female, you know, using those sorts of race categories as well. But another thing that we're also able to do to the query about wealth, for example, is we use the LSM measure, which is quite a common measure in market surveys. It's not an exact measure. It's also quite crude. But we're able to gauge the respondents' level of wealth or affluence based off this measure. So, you know, how many taps they have, whether they have running water, is the road in front of their house paved, for example, all those sorts of things. And again, the data is able to be disaggregated by these sorts of indicators. So whether someone lives in a rural area or an urban area, there does tend to be quite a large degree of difference in opinion. Not generally on national issues, but perhaps something on safety, for example. People in urban areas tend to feel more unsafe than those in rural areas. But again, if people are interested in this sort of thing, the report, as I mentioned at the beginning, is available on IJR's website, ijr.org.za. So you're able to download it and look through the full methodology. And also, if there are particular questions that you're interested in, whether different respondents said different things. But what we try to do is match it up to the best available data we have from Statistics South Africa.
Thank you for that insight, Mikhail. Download a copy of the report from the IGR's website. We need to engage this content. So there's a couple of comments that center around a particular theme, and I'll address them in that sort of way. It is very interesting to hear that people see the political parties as a source of division. That comment from Anonymous. And The second one being political parties enjoy less trust and voter rates are dropping. Do you think political parties are aware of that, and do they take it seriously enough to address these issues? Yeah, let's group those two together. Your thoughts. Let's take Stan. Let's give Stan a comment opportunity there. Political parties are the source of division. Do they know? Do they care? Are they going to address it?
Mikhail did mention that because last year, 2019, was an election year, it's to be expected that political parties will rise in terms of the role they play in society. But we see this is the interesting trend. Every time when there's an election, political parties, you know, as a source of division comes up. So that's the one thing to say. The second thing is, do they care? You know, I wish I could tell you, but the fact of the matter is, you know, yes, you can blame political parties for not listening because you know, if people have these feelings, then clearly they feel they are not being listened to. But I think what that also says is that perhaps the type of democracy that we have, and particularly our electoral system, you know, doesn't bring the people close to their representatives. Especially at national level, you vote for a party and the party decides who goes to parliament. And maybe that's another reason why people feel a bit removed from political parties. But I think political parties in general have not shown the people that they take the opinion of people very seriously. And that's just a personal opinion.
Absolutely agree with you on that one. Leading on to that one, I want to ask Mikhail a question here, in that independent political candidates, you know, it's on the table that independents will be able to vie for elections. Whether that will actually happen anytime soon remains to be seen, because there seems to be some resistance from the power structures. What kind of difference do you think this might make, the fact that independent candidates might be able to stand for elections, in terms of public trust and civil society organizing themselves?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's a good question, and it is unfortunately that I don't have the answer to. But if anyone does say they have the answer to that, they're probably lying, because I think it's a huge unknown about what's going to happen in the next few years. Parliament still needs to decide on the legislation for that. They've got close to 2 years to decide on it. But I think you know, reforming the electoral law to allow people to stand as independent candidates, I think will have a positive influence at a more local level, as we've seen with kind of municipal elections as well. I don't think it will be a significant change to national level politics, because smaller parties tend to be gathered around individual leaders anyhow. And what we've seen over the last maybe 10, 15 years is that people have tried to set up new parties to contest elections, essentially as leaders. And generally speaking, they haven't been too successful. So I don't think it will be a significant game changer for the national, you know, kind of electoral scene, but perhaps on a more municipal, on a more local level, I think it is a positive development. And, you know, not having the baggage of being part of a political party is something that people might find more attractive actually going forward, as we've seen with more people not engaging with elections. So I think it's still a big unknown. I think it's very early to offer too much insight on it, but I think it's a positive development, and it will be interesting to see how it unfolds going forward.
It's a question I enjoy asking on radio shows with political commentators, because to me, it seems like it might change the top down to perhaps a more circular sort of structure. Aideen, if you're ready for this question, I think you'll enjoy this one. In your judgment, do you think we have a sufficiently vibrant civil society to address the challenges that we have? And what role does civil society play in tackling these challenges?
Oh, okay. Well, I was just hoping to do the welcome and the closing. So. But anyway,
it's because I can see you on screen, but I can pass the question over to Stan and Mikhail.
Thank you. Well, I think, yes, South Africa has quite a vibrant civil society. I'm not sure. I think maybe we would like to hear from Stan and Mikhail about how effective the methodology and how they work. And I'm part of the civil society, so I'm not sure how much of influence we really have on the broader public opinion. But I suppose every small effort matters. And sometimes when from the locations where we least expect, when we go to a small society, you find a very vibrant group of people doing amazing things. And I think there is, and perhaps maybe the policymakers should look at harnessing those efforts.
Well, certainly the Turquoise Harmony Institute is a vibrant example of that. But let's pass the mic over to Stan, because we haven't heard him in a little while. In your judgment, do you think we have a sufficiently vibrant civil society to address the challenges we face? And what role does civil society play in tackling these challenges, Stan?
You know, I'm going to be cautious in our answer to this question, because there are times when we really have a vibrant civil society, but it's often around issues. And if something significantly, dangerous comes up, people stand together. I mean, this is a given example. I mean, gender-based violence. You know, there's a march, and but something needs to happen. The past president Zuma, and so then you see the vibrancy, then you see people being interested in change. That vibrancy is not a consistent vibrancy. And so when you talk about a vibrant civil society, you're essentially talking about organizations that kind of operate in various spaces. And there are disconnects. You take an organization like IJR, for instance. We play in a particular sphere, but then you have a social movement that perhaps takes a more radical and in-your-face confrontational approach, and then you have small community-based NGOs that deal with bread and butter issues, and so. It's a very difficult question to answer, but generally, if you compare South African civil society with civil societies elsewhere on the continent and in the world, then certainly our civil society is quite vibrant compared to others.
Mikhail, would you like to comment on that question?
Yeah, I think I just have to echo what Stan said about that. I mean, the thing about having an active or vibrant civil society is that it sometimes might feel as though not enough is being done. But if you have to look at, relatively speaking, the sort of influence that civil society is able to garner, the sort of membership that it has, relatively speaking, to other countries that are similar to us in the region, on the continent, or really in the world, even compared to perhaps European countries with longer traditions of this sort of thing, South African civil society is extremely influential and vibrant. And that's something that we have to be grateful for as well. Whether we can do more, of course, I think that's inevitable. But I also think that civil society by itself can't achieve too much. What it's supposed to do, I think, is to really link different sectors of society together. So, making sure that business is involved in certain things, making sure that the private sector is held to account, but also ensuring that there's some sort of connection between all these different groups or interest groups as well. And I think that's something that we can definitely do better going forward, but it's something that, relatively speaking, we do relatively well. But of course, there's more to do, and there's so many challenges to overcome, as mentioned in the presentation, that civil society really has an important role to play going forward.
Absolutely. And we've seen a lot of the strengthening of that role during the COVID-19 lockdown in terms of social cohesion on one hand, but social justice on the other. And I want to come to that in a bit, but we've got two questions first. Aisha Kaji, would the IGR be open to making the raw data available for data mapping purposes, for example, for inclusion in WASI map? Mikhail?
So yes, so we do make the data publicly available. Unfortunately, we don't have a sort of download portal, but again, if you go onto our website and the link to the South African Reconciliation Barometer, my email is there. I'd be happy to share the data set with you. We do work quite closely with other civil society organizations, with government institutions, with the Department for Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, to ensure that our data is being used to inform policy making as well. So yes, we do make the data available. A lot of people use it. It's well regarded, and it's something that we're hoping to do more and more of, obviously. But again, my email address is on the IGR website, and if you'd like to use it yourself, then please get in touch.
Absolutely. Anonymous attendee says, wonderful, informative program. Thank you very much, of course, to the THI and the IJR. And then we've got a question from Nuseba Nina, who says, we're seeing a great deal of huge elite development projects going through. And communities are finding it hard to keep up in responding to the inappropriate structures not aligned with local heritage and landscape. They aren't catered for the local middle, let alone lower income people. Therefore, there seems to be a worsening push towards inequality. Would welcome your comments for justice, preventing or allowing further inequality in spatial planning. Mikhail?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and something that we've seen, throughout the lockdown period as well, with the rise in evictions and those sorts of things. It's definitely something that we will have to address, and the pandemic has really accelerated a lot of the decline in these sorts of things. But again, just to perhaps link it to the previous point, I think what we're also seeing in response to these sorts of crises that are unfolding is an active civil society trying to represent people, trying to ensure that their rights are recognized. So we do a bit of that in our advocacy work as well, but other organizations as well, paralegal institutions, those working in various communities. We've seen community action networks springing up all over the country. What we're seeing is people are getting together to realize that this is a major issue and that there should be action followed up on it. So again, a lot of this is unfolding at the moment, and it's difficult to tell the future. But I think in as much as it's a problem in terms of spatial inequality, what we're also seeing is civil society advocating for spatial justice, advocating for greater equality in these sorts of projects as well. So that's something that we need to continue supporting as well.
Stan, any comment on that one before I want to turn over to talking about education and xenophobia, some of the issues that I found very interesting in that presentation?
Thank you. I think it's such a critical question because it really speaks of how we consult each other, the scent, and I think that is a big challenge, and I think the role of civil society is to be vigilant, to remain vigilant. COVID-19 has really been a game changer. It has caused a seismic shift in so many areas, and once it dies down, I believe we're now down to level 1, going to level 1, and civil society in particular must be vigilant that some of our rights that we've now given up because of COVID, that those rights are not further eroded. And so it's really critical that our vigilance must be to protect those who are most marginalized, and because often they are the forgotten ones.
Absolutely agree with you on that one. There were a couple of findings during this presentation that I thought were very interesting. The one regarding inequality being identified as a main source of division was so interesting for me because society realizes that it's more about class than it is about race. And we've come a long way in the last 26 years on that. Political parties being divisive, that's already being raised. But social mobility, Mikhail, 51% of the respondents said the education they currently receive is sufficient. But lockdown will change that perception, certainly, because a large majority of our country did not have access to the technological tools required for them to stay in their curriculum program. So certainly if you do this survey again next year, so much is going to change. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's also why I'm so excited to do the next survey, to find out exactly how much has changed, but also perhaps how little has changed in certain aspects as well. Yeah, I think the finding on education is surprising to all of us who work on the survey. You know, we hear about the matric results at the beginning of the year every year, but we also know that so many people are falling through the cracks. So many children aren't making it to matric, aren't being seen in those results as well. We know the sorts of crisis that's been occurring with education in terms of access just to basic sanitation facilities as well. So, you know, the impact of COVID-19 will be completely transformative. But I still think that you know, just over half of respondents said that they felt confident or were able to achieve their goals with the education that they're receiving, despite the state of education in many parts of South Africa. That question is really interesting because it tests people's perceptions about things, their resolve to handle the sorts of resources that they're able to use. So despite what we may think about the quality of education, people were reasonably confident that it was good enough for them to achieve their goals. But of course, I think a lot of this will change, has changed already in public opinion, and will certainly change next year going forward. So yes, it's something that we're very excited to be able to track next year, and hopefully we'll be able to share the findings, the next year's findings with you as well.
Well, we look forward to that. The fractures have been revealed in unprecedented ways, and so too will civil society begin to rise to that challenge, as we already have in many ways, as we've already discussed. Stan, I want to talk about xenophobia in terms of, you know, interpersonal trust. We had, you know, family at the top, neighbors, etc., religion, sexual orientation, and then this mistrust in terms of xenophobia, whether people living on the African continent or outside of it. And I thought that was, you know, personally disappointing, but also quite disturbing in that South Africans identify inequality to be our biggest challenge. And that arises from our own economic issues, from the lack of resources or the expropriation of resources and corruption, etc., etc. And yet there is this distrust of non-South Africans. So what's going on here? There seems to be a disconnect, Stan. What do you think?
That's, you know, if I had the answer to that question, I would not be sitting here. I would be in some island that I've bought with the money. You know, seriously, I think that you know, it's a really, really complex issue. And so we use the word xenophobia, you know, and it, you know, in South Africa, it doesn't have the exact meaning as it would have in another country. Because xenophobia, in essence, is the fear of foreigners. Okay? So the question that you have to ask, so what is the fear that is feeding, you know, South Africans? And let's be honest here, it is poor South Africans, generally. Because if you look at foreign nationals living in the suburbs and in middle-class areas, there's very little, you know, a kind of in-your-face xenophobia. And so one has to understand that given the levels of poverty, given the levels of inequality, for people in that situation, they see, and bearing in mind also that there's no safety net for a foreign national coming into South Africa, you know, so there's no social help. And so where do they go for survival? They go into the poorest of the poor areas, you know, because that's where they can afford to rent a shack and so forth. And then they compete for the very scarce resource of jobs with the very people in those communities. And so really, that's why I say it is much more complex than just saying South Africans are xenophobic. Of course it's wrong. Of course one has to condemn it. But it is much more complex than just xenophobia, because it happens in the poorest areas. And there must be something that we have to say about that. And it doesn't make it right. I think it's appalling that we treat fellow human beings, and particularly fellow human beings from our own continent, in the way that we do.
Absolutely,
and
agree
we
with
cannot
you
defend
on
it.
that.
Cannot defend it, but it's complex.
It is complex. I want to talk about employment next, but a quick feedback from Jan de Groef. Thanks for the webinar. It's quite informative, hopeful, and at the same time challenging. All right, so we were talking about, during your presentation, you said, Mikhail, you hope this comes up a little bit later on. So let's talk about it. Race categorization versus race representation in employment, right? What is the way forward? Do we need to move away from a tick box on race to rather class when it comes to employment, employing people according to which economic class they come from? And that might be a more equitable way to employ people as opposed to race categorization. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you're not asking an easy question. I think it's obviously a very contentious issue with all sorts of policy debates happening at the moment amongst different political parties. I would be skeptical of a move towards a class-based system of representation or affirmative action, simply because it's, in as much as racial classification is uncomfortable for many people, it represents the very dark past of this country. But if you have to delve into a class situation, it's equally invasive, perhaps even more so. Asking how much someone earns, or what their parents do for a living, or what sort of house they live in. Again, there are perhaps easier ways to come up with proxies for disadvantage. So universities have famously done this over the last 10 years. So instead of just looking at quotas for particular race groups, they've tried to gauge income or means tests, those sorts of things. But I think across the board, it would be quite difficult to do. And then just to follow up on that as well, every year the Center for Employment Equity produces a report on the state of the private sector. And every year we see very similar results, that the fact that the private sector, generally speaking, especially at top management levels, has simply not transformed to be representative of the demographics of South Africa. And, it's very difficult to justify getting rid of a race-based classification system, which simply hasn't succeeded yet, despite 2 decades of this policy in the private sector, and especially at top management levels. But I don't think, again, there's an easy answer to this sort of question. But what the data does reveal is that South Africans want the workforce to be representative of race classifications in South Africa, and that will be difficult to achieve if you try to ignore race. But I think perhaps there are better ways to improve employment equity going forward.
It will be interesting to see how the report looks different next year, considering the unemployment that's gotten even worse. And of course, people's views on corruption post the COVID-19 lockdown, given all that we've seen in the media regarding corruption. I think your report is going to be even more fascinating next year. And I dare say, Stan, that in terms of xenophobia, the media narrative has got a lot to do with driving xenophobia in our country. And there's plenty of research to support that statement. There was a final comment which allows us to now round up our evening's program. Do you see a tangible impact of your surveys in changing the narrative around reconciliation in public and in government? So I can give you 30 seconds, Mikhail, on that one.
It's difficult to gauge the influence of the survey directly. Certainly in the public, it's a little more difficult to do, but this is why we do these sorts of events. This is why we collaborate with other organizations. This is why we host our own events. And it's something that we want to do more and more of, is to get the survey out there, not only online or not only in policy discussions or in boardrooms or things like that, but to actually let people see the results of national public opinion. And then on the other side, I think we are seeing greater sorts of policy buy-in of the survey. We are seeing that people are paying attention to it. It's a crucial resource in government planning. And as Stan mentioned, the president himself quoted directly from the report quite extensively for Reconciliation Day last year. So we are seeing that there is some sort of buy-in on this. But again, the survey and the report is complex. It shows its strengths, but it also shows the weaknesses in society. And I think we really need to engage with it in its totality, showing that where there has been progress before, but also how much work there still needs to be done as well. So I think that's really the message we're trying to get out there, is that things aren't all doom and gloom. They're perhaps not as negative as we like to make out to be, but of course there are significant challenges to overcome going forward.
Absolutely agree with you. Before I say goodbye, I want to hand over the mic to Aydin Inal for his conclusion on behalf of the THI.
Thank you, Shabnam. I think in closing, I just want to say thank you to you, to Stan, Mikhail, and everyone who has joined with their questions, comments, and through by just following the event. And really, I think it has been a very informative, eye-opening evening. So we hope that in our work we can take these findings in consideration, and we can make a difference where the differences needs to be made. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aydin Inal, Western Cape Regional Coordinator for the Turquoise Harmony Institute, as well as Mikhail Musa and Stan Henkemann from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation for this brilliant, incisive, robust, and challenging webinar that we've had this evening. Certainly lots of work ahead of us. In conclusion, South Africans are proud of our national identity. Despite the serious challenges that we face, the ground is indeed fertile for civil society to organize for the kind of country that we want. On behalf of the Turquoise Harmony Institute, we say thank you to our audience, our commenters, our listeners, and our viewers. And we look forward to hosting you at the next event of the Turquoise Harmony Institute. For me, Shabnam Palesa Mohammed, it's good night and go in peace. Assalamu alaikum.
Right.
Thank you for all. It was great. I learned a lot. Thank you, Mikhail. It was interesting to go in details. But I hope, as you said, we need to publicize this as much as we can. We are going to use our social media platforms. I don't know if you have some visuals of these graphics and little bit explanations, that we can put on the social media. We can easily, do that.
I think that's a very good idea.
Yeah. No, we open to that kind of thing. And let me just say that, I mean,